For it was a witty and truthful rejoinder which was given by a captured pirate to Alexander the Great. The king asked the fellow, "What is your idea in infesting the sea?" And the pirate answered with uninhibited insolence, "The same as yours in infesting the earth. But because I do it with a tiny craft, I'm called a pirate. Because you have a mighty navy, you're called an emperor." These words, written by St. Augustine, encapsulate one of the most fundamental problems of political philosophy. Namely, why governments are morally justified to take actions that no individual or group of individuals are permitted to take. Governments demand a portion of everyone's income, decide what substances may be consumed, regulate and restrict voluntary transactions, and even force individuals to fight their wars. These, among many other things, would be seen as ethically impermissible if undertaken by any individual or group other than one's government.
What is anarcho-capitalism, and how do you differentiate between that version of anarchism or anarchy and other sort of more leftist conceptions?
The term anarchy gets used by a variety of different people in different ways. But I would have said that for the ones who I would say really are anarchists on the left, the real problem is what economists call the coordination problem. That you have a society with many millions of people. Doing anything requires the cooperation of a large number of those people. Somebody's got to harvest the food, turn the food into cereal, deliver it to you, get the milk, etc., etc. And how do you coordinate them? The anarcho-capitalism version is you just expand the way we coordinate things a little bit farther to include the things government now does, so that you have, in effect, law and law enforcement and dispute arbitration and such produced on the market the same way cars and food are. That, it seems to me, is a much more believable story than to say that somehow people in an unexplained way will coordinate their activity to produce everything right.
Oftentimes libertarians will talk to anarcho-capitalists and they'll butt heads and such. What to your mind is sort of the difference between a sort of libertarian conception of the way society should work and an anarcho-capitalist?
Well, I would have said that anarcho-capitalism is one form of libertarianism, that we sometimes distinguish anarchists from minarchists, meaning people who want not much government but some. And the fundamental problem with the minarchist position, I think, and this was the way I started my talk today, is that they believe that governments are incompetent to produce food and cars and housing and stuff, and that therefore the right way to run a society is by private property and trade under a framework of laws that make all that possible. But they're then relying on the government to produce that framework of laws. Producing laws is not an easier problem than producing cars or food. So if the government's incompetent to do a good job of producing cars and food, why do you expect it to do a good job of producing the legal system within which you are then going to produce the cars and the food?
The definition is very simple and objective.
Yeah, what is
Anyone who will enforce any idea or prejudice by physical force, anyone who initiates the use of force against another human being, in that instant is acting like a dictator. And if he establishes that as a political system, then that's a dictatorship. But I'm the arch enemy of physical force.
Right.
I'm for freedom of the mind and for bringing people to your ideas by persuasion, not by force.
Could you bring your moral perceptions and principles to a meeting in 1917, 1920, 22 to assassinate the Tsar?
Why assassinate him? He fell, you know, by a bloodless
but
revolution.
you don't know that. You didn't know that at the time.
Well,
You're armchair quarterbacking now. I'm asking you in the Dietrich Bonhoeffer sense, could you plot to overthrow a person that you thought was obviously, in your mind, denying civil rights to other people?
Plot against him, certainly. But I always said you should. You have the moral right to retaliate with force if someone imposes force on you.
So you're for self-defense?
Oh, yes,
And
but not murder. And that is a profound difference.
But when the underground people in Germany started meeting and saying, let's knock off Hitler, that's morally acceptable?
Oh, totally.
Just checking.
Well, so I hold to common sense morality, basically. So, I mean, the reason why I think there are problems with the state is not that I have like some weird alternative, really strong ethical claim like some libertarians do. I think that the state is violating the ordinary principles of morality that we apply to everyone. right? And I don't think that we need like some grand theory that tells you what's right in all circumstances. I think what we need is just, there are certain situations in which you would say somebody acted wrongly. So if I go up to other people and I just like force them to give me their money, that's generally considered wrong. And it's not considered okay, even if I'm like, then I give it to the poor, right? I go and mud people on the street and then I send the money to Oxfam, which is, helping the poor. That's generally not considered permissible, right? So, I mean, it's not really that I have a theory. It's just that I have the ethical reactions that normal people have, and I just apply them to the state. And most people just don't apply the same moral norms to the state that they apply to everyone else.
Never initiate force against somebody else. And that is, a pretty simple principle that everybody should endorse. It's a principle of what makes civilization. That is, you respect other people's life, you respect other people's property. Thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not murder. It's that simple, and most everybody agrees to that. And the next question ought to be is, well, why should you be different than Republicans and Democrats if they tend to agree with that same principle? Well, we believe it's such an important moral principle that if we can't take somebody else's property and we can't hurt anybody or we can't intimidate anybody or threaten to use force, we don't think the government can either. But we see the government as the initiator of force to bring about social and economic changes day in and day out. I mean, they may not come up to our front door with a gun, and occasionally they do. But we know if we don't deliver our money and our records and do obediently what the government wants in order to give up our portion of our income through the Internal Revenue Service, the gun will be quickly at our door and we will be in prison. So it's the threat and the intimidation, and therefore they're transferring wealth, something that we can't do as individuals. So we as libertarians reject this whole idea of forcible redistribution of wealth, which is the welfare state. Same way in personal liberties. We apply this principle in the area of personal liberties, and although I might want you and think you should lead a certain lifestyle because I think it's good and right and moral, I have no right to tell you what to do. If you want to live a certain way and I disagree, that's tough. That's your choosing. That's the individual's choice, as long as you don't hurt somebody else.
Well, anarchism, there's one R that they throw in there, right? So anarchism means without rulers. There's no centralized coercive authority. And one of the reasons why anarchism is so appealing is not only is it intellectually consistent, but also when you have a centralized pyramid of power in society, you have no rules. They change all the time. I mean, just look at what happened with spying on the Trump administration and the lying about it and these allegations. The FBI is changing records and can't find, there's no rules. Look at the Clintons. I mean, so when you get this, you don't get rules. You just get chaos and bribery and panic and manipulation and lies. And so that's no rules. So anarchism simply says, without rulers, no rulers. But everyone takes that last R out and says, that means no rules. And it's like, no, we want rules. Right now, we have no rules. In a free society, the rules are negotiated, they're consistent, they're the minimum necessary, they're constantly being whittled away as new technology arises and so on. And so this idea that anarchism means without rules, anarchism is the only way we ever get consistent, objective and rational rules in society. You're never going to get it through the state. It's too subject to the power principle.
When you hear the word libertarian, you think, well, gosh, libertarians, they want anything goes, right? No rules, no laws, you can do whatever you want. And it's not exactly what we advocate. Libertarians do advocate freedom, liberty. We advocate government ought to leave you alone and that you ought to get to make choices on your own. But would that mean lawlessness? Would that mean no rules, anything goes? Well, even libertarians believe in some sort of rules. And so one of the rules that libertarians believe in is something called the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle means that under a libertarian society, if we had one, you pretty much could do whatever you wanted as long as you didn't hurt somebody else. So as long as you didn't invade their sphere of their rights, you could kind of do what you wanted. And you say, well, gosh, then there still would be all kinds of crazy things. Everybody would be doing heroin, there'd be prostitution, there'd be all these things. And really, many of us who are Christian and libertarian believe that not only would you be restrained by government from doing things that would harm somebody else, but that a libertarian society or even a republic, as we were intended to be, would have some kind of restraint. And some people have described it as virtue, Washington described the beginning of the Republic, and he said it would be necessary for our country to succeed to have virtue. So you'd have the idea that the government would restrain you from harming other individuals, but there has to be something that also guides us, that keeps us on the straight and narrow, allows us to cooperate as a civilized society, allows us to be an advanced society. Most of us don't steal. Most of us don't rape, murder, do all these horrific things, not because there's a law against it, but because we have a sense of right and wrong.
Voluntarism, I see, here I am assuming I'm talking mostly to voluntarists. Voluntarism is, well, it can be with or without the why. It just means advocating a society in which all human interaction is voluntary instead of violent. And that rules out government, because government is always inherently violent. So voluntarism is just more precise and more specific version of what I believe, more precise and specific than anarchism. Anarchism means no rulers. Technically, you can be an anarchist who runs around chopping people up with an axe, as long as you don't advocate a ruling class. You can't be a voluntarist who runs around chopping up people with an axe, because that's not a voluntary action. Which is one reason that the term voluntarist is better, but it's also something nobody's ever heard of.
How did you come to call yourself an anarchist? I know it's been a long journey for you, and eventually you got to the point of being an anarchist. How did you get to that point?
I prefer the term voluntarist, actually, and it's one of those cases where the more clearly you understand the problem, the more clearly you can articulate the solution. So as obviously throughout anyone who's seen the Corbett Report and my journey over the past 8 years trying to document all the things I document, it was really the logical, inevitable outcome of that, because once you identify the problem of concentrated power in entities like these governments, which are always trying to accumulate more and more power and trying to obviously send it further and further up the pyramid, the only counteraction to that is to decentralize, to localize, to bring the power back down the pyramid, back down to the individuals. And there is no statist philosophy that can accompany and accomplish that. So I use as the basis for my sort of ethical principle, my basic ethical principle for the construction of any political ideology should be that the only valid basis for human interaction amongst adults is voluntary participation. And once you've got that as a base, I don't care what you build on that base. You can have your anarcho-syndicalist community, or your free market libertarian community, or whatever it is, as long as it's based on voluntary participation, that's all that matters. And I think that is the answer to the problems that we're documenting here.
And I'll go through which one do you want to touch first?
Voluntarism.
Voluntarism. I like that phrase because anarchy sounds scary, right? Anarchy sounds scary. When the average person, when a libertarian hears anarchy, they go, yay! When the average person hears anarchy, they go, oh my God, blood in the streets, zombie apocalypse. Yeah, they assume that, right? They think it's The Walking Dead season 4. That's what they assume that's happening, right? The second that you say anarchy. And what I'm trying to get to them is, a voluntary society, volunteerism. That sounds good. That's why I like it. It's the idea of people wanting to do. It's the idea of people. When people get upset about, well, there are people suffering, there are people struggling, you're right, and that will always be the case. But when someone has a problem, whether that is mental, physical, financial, whatever it might be, whatever issue they might have, medical, who cares, whatever that issue is, the first thing they need is not a program. It's not services. The first thing they need is someone who cares. When they get someone who cares, that person can now give them the things they need to get their self together, whatever that is, right? The problem is we have decided that people need services. And I hear this all the time, particularly in New York. It's all over, but particularly in New York, my child has a need, so they need services. Yeah, services are fine, and they are. But services are cookie cutter that put your child in a box, and now you feel like your child's going to have success because they got services. I don't want your child to have services. I want your child to have the best success your child can have with whatever their special need is. And what I know is some bureaucrat in Albany is not going to have that answer. But with some individual who maybe has had that issue before, who knows children who've had your issue, who's worked with them, might that person know? Yeah. And they also might be able to tell you what you can expect and help you decide what can be success for your child and for your family. right? People say, well, they're special needs, they need X. If you have anyone in your life who has special needs, I have a niece who's autistic. If you have anyone in your life who has special needs, it's a wide spectrum of what special needs are. You know, there's one special needs child whose success is getting dressed on their own. Another special needs child's success is having a job and living on their own. And the wide gap in between. How can you decide what success is? By services. I want volunteerism means I get what's real, and that is the individual decides, I want to help you. And when they want to help you, you get good help. It's the idea that it's not about someone saying, here's a cookie cutter, we've checked the box, have a nice day. It's we want to help, we want to make things happen. And you might say, but Larry, that never works. That's completely not true at all. All of the best, if you've seen any of the programs that government has even tried to adopt, almost all of them began as voluntary programs. Almost every one of them, and then the government grabbed them and they became worse. That's almost universal. There's some exceptions, but very often it worked well before and now doesn't. The best programs are now voluntary. In fact, there's one right now in Massachusetts that I'm talking about. I'm going to bring to New York. It's called Humvee, and it's housing units for military veterans, and it's a prison system just for people who are veterans. And it's run by one paid guard and the rest all volunteers. That's happening now. People who want to help veterans, and there are literally millions of people who want to help veterans and will do it well for free. But Larry, there's no credentials. Does it work? The recidivism rate right now in Massachusetts is about 70%. And that's pretty much throughout the entire country. It's about 70%. For that program, it's less than 5%. That means less than 5% of people come back to jail from that voluntary program. This is what volunteerism is about. People wanting to do, people deciding to do, and people deciding what a success among themselves. This is the goal.
I mean, look, I have a problem with the way government raises almost all revenue. I mean, I reject the whole system of like taxation at the threat of violence. I think it's like primitive and barbaric, and when human beings look back on that, it's going to be the way we look back at like slavery or arranged marriage or whatever it is, that the idea that the way we fund our organization, you know, like let's say there are these services that are necessary. So the way we fund that is we go, you have to pay a portion of your income or we'll fucking throw you in jail.
Yeah, we'll put you in a cage.
Lock you in a cage, like an animal. This is like, that's the biggest thing when I'm arguing now with people about like libertarianism versus other, you know, ways that we should organize society. That's my biggest thing that I harp on is just like, okay, who should we throw in a cage? Who is it morally acceptable to throw into a cage forcefully? Like send men with guns to get them and throw them into a cage. Like I'll grant you a murderer, a rapist, someone who assaults somebody. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we go into like theft.
Yeah, theft.
Things like that, because that is a violation of, you know, you own yourself and then you own your possession.
Sure.
So that's a violation. But are you really okay if someone's like, oh, I don't want to fund that program? I won't send my money in to fund the war because I don't believe in the war. So now we can throw that guy in a cage.
Yeah.
Or I don't want to fund look, even if you have a really noble charity, why should you be able to threaten violence against someone to get them to fund it?
Well, that's where I like Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson steps in and says, we don't need the IRS. It's like, listen, we don't need, that's not how we have to make money. We just put taxes on consumption.
I like Gary Johnson. I wish he would be a little more Ron Paul. But
in what way?
I just feel like Gary Johnson has this way of selling the libertarianism as this kind of like, well, you know, it's more practical if we do it the libertarian way.
Huh.
Whereas I like, you know, when he's asked about the wars, he'll say things like, he goes, I think if you look on average, these military interventions have hurt more than they've helped.
That is exactly how he sounds. That's a really good impression.
Yeah, I've watched a lot of them. Well, so by the way, that's not necessarily incorrect. It's just like, who would talk about mass murder that way? I mean, it's like talking about slavery, and you're like, well, I just think overall this is an inefficient way to get cotton. And you're like, Jesus, dude! Like, and you're head abolitionist? Really? You're supposed to represent the abolitionist movement,
right?
With that attitude.
So he's like a moderate radical.
Yeah, he's just a pragmatist, man. He's just like, this makes more sense, which is fine.
Yeah.
But I don't really want to sell libertarianism as like, I think we're fiscally conservative and socially liberal.
But he's a bridge, because he was a lifelong Republican. Like he's a good bridge to getting people to consider an alternative party, and maybe one of the only ones that's currently available.
See, I believe in a little bit more like a case for radicalism. I think that so Ron Paul, when he was in the 2007-2008 debates, he got a whole lot of people interested in libertarianism. And he didn't do it by being like a bridge to like, before I tell you, slavery is horribly immoral, let me first convince you it's inefficient and ineffective. And then he went right to like, this is wrong. This is wrong. We're killing people in countries around the world. Like, this is morally horrible. And he got a movement going when he was in those debates. Gary Johnson was in one of the major debates in 2012. Do you remember anything from his performance? Because nobody ever does.
No.
Nobody ever does. Because he'll go in there and say things like, in New Mexico, I was able to balance the budget with cutting 7%. And you're like, you have the greatest political philosophy ever devised by man behind you. Libertarian. You have the answer to all this shit. You're the abolitionist in slavery times. And like,
So you really feel libertarianism is the answer to everything?
Well, no. It's not in the same way that abolition isn't the answer to everything during slavery. It's the first moral step to then we can live in a...
What about libertarianism is so attractive to you?
I think it's philosophically sound, and it's basically just, to me, it's a humble understanding of what existence is, and that we don't really know what this is. Man's kind of born into the world naked, and we're here with nature, and we're all trying to figure it out. And that, morally speaking, we should all own our own lives, and therefore own your own body. And basically it all centers around property rights and the non-aggression principle, which is just the idea that you should never initiate violence against a non-violent person. And then you just draw conclusions from that.
Well, those are all really standard.
Should I be put in a cage because I smoke marijuana? And I still have that duality, that cognitive dissonance, because the answer is obviously no, but I can't picture a world without a government. And I'm just trying to be as honest as possible about that.
I get
because
that.
It's like, I know you're right. Because I can't get past that thing, but I also might have just a little bit of Stockholm syndrome where I'm like, but the
listen,
government
no, I understand that. The government is like the reserve parachute. It's like, okay, free market.
Oh, right.
Oh, shit. It's flying off into the sun and it's being attacked by eagles. And I have my reserve parachute called government, because otherwise, I'm just a perfectly consistent moral stain on the sidewalk. So I understand that. Let me sort of give you a tiny analogy, because the whole point is you're not supposed to be able to conceive of a life or a society without a state. You can't. That's the whole point of freedom. If you could conceive of it, you'd be the one in charge of it and organizing it. It's sort of like saying, I can't conceive, go back to like 1985 and say, what's communications technology going to be like in 35 years? Well, if you could conceive of that, you'd end up owning the entire market, because you'd get the reason. Like, the whole point of freedom is you can't figure out what the heck is going on. And that's the great lie of government and central planning, that they have some clue. So I'll give you a sort of an example. Now, all societies prior to the modern West, for the most part, and there was the great crusade of the British Empire, was to eliminate slavery. So all societies everywhere throughout all time had dabbled in slavery off and on. And a lot of societies that had slavery continuously throughout their history, particularly the Middle East. So let's say you and I are having a debate, I don't know, it's like 1820 or something like that. So we got, weird ruffles and uncomfortable wigs and shit like that. So we're having a debate and you say, okay, well, if we get rid of slavery, who's going to pick the cotton? Right? Who's going to pick the food? Like, so you'll have to pay people who are now working for free. And if you pay people, you have to jack up the price of your fruit and of your cotton, so to the point where poor people won't be able to afford it and they're starved to death. Right? Okay, that seems reasonable. And I say, hey man, I smoked some wild peyote last night and I had a vision. Let me tell you, Owen, what my vision was. My vision was that after we get rid of slaves, after we end slavery, there are going to be these giant metallic robots that sweep back and forth across the fields. And they're going to be powered by crushed prehistoric tree juice. And then there will be flat, roads of like, they don't change in summer and winter, flat, perfectly even roads, and giant wheeled machines, also powered by the same squished prehistoric tree juice, will go rocketing across at speeds we can't even fathom, while at the same time, there will be these giant flying machines that are halfway to space.
Right.
These giant exploding tubes of metal, also, oddly enough, powered by the same crushed prehistoric tree juice, and they will fly all over the place, and everything will be cheaper over time.
And Bruce Jenner's a chick.
So earlier on I noted kind of a puzzle about government versus regular people. If virtuous Vanny decides that you shouldn't buy sugar and eat sugar and then forbids you from doing that, you call the cops and she gets arrested. If on the other hand your congressperson decides that and the government forbids you from doing it, you can't call the cops will be the ones that will help make sure you're not allowed to do it. So what could justify that? And also in particular, when the government makes these orders, do you have to follow them? So if you think about it, the government's ordering you around all the time. They're saying you can't eat this, you can't eat that, you're allowed to buy this, but only if you pay this tax ahead of time. You're allowed to sell this, but only if you get this license and fill out these forms and pay this tax. You have to drive this fast and not this fast. At the end of the year, you get to fill in some forms and turn in a third of your money, et cetera, et cetera. It's constantly bossing you around in ways that, like, if I were to do that, you would think I'm a horrible person. But if the government does it, we think it's okay. So what could justify that? And why do you have any obligation to go along with those rules? So let me just introduce a couple concepts. Philosophers talk about what we call government legitimacy and government authority. And these are separate concepts. And they're not always used exactly the same way by every philosopher, but this is how I'm going to use them. The word legitimacy refers to the right to create rules and enforce them, and violently perhaps. If you think about it, government rules are enforced with violence. So if you get a speeding ticket, what they might just say is, well, you were speeding, we order you to pay $25 on the top of whatever you were doing. That's just another order. But eventually, if you don't pay that ticket, they'll forbid you to drive, which is just an order that you don't drive. But if you keep driving, eventually what will happen is they'll come with lights blazing and beat you up and throw you in jail, or perhaps worse. So every time the government makes a rule and enforces it, it's effectively threatening you with violence, perhaps even to the point of death if you continue resisting. Authority, on the other hand, refers to something like a power to create in other people an obligation to do something. So when they command you to do something, you have to do it. And in particular, it has to be because they said so. So if you think about it, like is there an obligation to obey the law? Well, the law sometimes requires you to do things you have pre-existing moral obligations to do. So I have an obligation not to kill you that exists independently of the law, and vice versa. So yeah, there's a law that says I'm not supposed to murder you, but I also have a moral obligation not to do that. So it's not clear that I have to do it because the law says so. It looks like I just have to do it because that's what morality requires, period. So we have to look for the question, are there laws or rules that you have to obey because the government commands you to do so? Like, I have to pass in my taxes because I'm told to do so. I have a moral duty to do what the government says. Surprisingly, even though the typical political philosopher is, probably a moderate Democrat and, fairly, into the state and advocates having a nation state and a fairly strong nation state, the kind of dominant view in political philosophy right now is skepticism about government authority, skepticism about whether there is any such thing as an obligation to obey the law. So the average view now is what's called philosophical anarchism. So philosophical anarchism is really the view that governments can be legitimate, but they're not authoritative, which means that it's okay for governments to exist of a certain sort. It's okay for them to create and enforce certain kinds of rules, but you don't actually have an obligation to obey any of the rules because the government says so. Again, we're just talking about rules that you wouldn't have any pre-existing obligation to go along with. So you shouldn't murder me just because it's the wrong thing to do, independent of what the government says. So throughout history, though, most people have believed in the duty to obey the law. Most people now believe there is such a thing as a duty to obey the law. But it's kind of puzzling why there would be. Like, why would the government be allowed to create an obligation in you when the average person wouldn't? What could possibly justify that? And there have been not hundreds, but there have been a large number of theories offered on behalf of this, including one that's actually in the, there's actually even a theory in the Declaration of Independence, which is what we call consent theory. The idea that, this is what I've heard in civics classes all growing up. Well, government has authority because it rests upon the consent of the governed. The idea here is something like, you have in effect a contract with the government. It's offering you certain goods and services, and in response, you offer your obedience. You're basically making a contract. The government will provide me with certain things, and then I will obey its orders as my way of kind of paying for those things, or part of it. The idea is like, you made a promise to obey, and you have to keep your promise. The problem with that view, though, is that it's just false. It just didn't happen. Right? So David Hume, a British philosopher, or a Scottish philosopher, wrote hundreds of years ago, this whole theory of a social contract is just, historically speaking, a bunch of nonsense. It's not like there was actually a social contract written. The social contract is not worth the paper it wasn't written on. Instead, what happened was governments arose through conquest and war, stationary bandits deciding it was better to kind of stay in power as opposed to like just preying on their people. And there was no actual contract that took place. Further, it doesn't look like our relationship to government is at all consensual. Now again, it's not to say we shouldn't have government, that's a separate question, but it's just to say we don't appear to have a consensual relationship with government. And to see why, think about a genuinely consensual transaction, see how it goes, and then compare that to a government interaction.
Well, the first thing I would suggest to the people who are listening to this debate is that the way that I learned how to debate way back in the day in college was to start by definitions. Now, Tom put forward some, I think, faulty analogies. The government is like a gun. My love is like a red, red rose. But what I would argue is that we need to begin with precision. We need to begin with definition. So there are three main things that need to be defined in this conversation. The first is, what is a government? I mean, the problem is if you think you know something when you don't, then you will always go astray. If you think that you're looking at a compass and you're actually looking at a whirligig, you're not going to go the right direction in the woods. So what is a government? The second thing that needs to be defined is morality, specifically good and evil. Because if we're saying that the government is or is not evil, we need to know what the government is, we need to know what good is, and we need to know what evil is. Then we can make a comparison. And people who put forward analogies prior to definitions are usually up to something fairly tricky. So please check that you still have your wallets and your watches on your persons. So I will provide the definitions that should have been provided already. The first is the government is a group of individuals who possess the legal right to initiate force in a given geographical area. Let me say that again to make sure it sinks in. I don't think this is a particularly unusual definition. It's not, pulled out of some left field. Barack Obama has said the government is force. So the government is a group of individuals with the legal right, in fact, the obligation to initiate force in a given geographical area. So that's what a government is. Now, as far as good and evil goes, obviously that's a very, very big conversation. And so I'll just touch on it very briefly here. I think that most of us will accept that the initiation of force is immoral. That's, I think, pretty essential. Violations of property rights are just a different way of initiating force. Now, you may disagree with that, but the reality is that these are things that the government bans in its legal structure. Almost all governments across the world and throughout history have banned these kinds of things. So, for instance, they have banned they have banned the initiation of force, and they have banned violations of property rights. So what we can say is that the people who inhabit the government themselves view the initiation of force as immoral, and themselves view violations of property rights as immoral. So by the government's own standards, by the legal framework's own standards, by the legal precedents that Tom is mentioning, the initiation of force and violations of property rights are immoral. And if they're not immoral, then the government is immoral for enforcing them. So there's no way to make the government moral if these things are moral or immoral, because the government enforces them. If the government enforces the non-aggression principle and the government violates the non-aggression principle, then the government is immoral. If the government enforces a respect for property rights and then the government violates the negation of property rights, then the government is, by definition, immoral.
You turn on the news, it never comes up. Never comes up. Any of this shit. Like, it's just, whatever. They always try to scare you about something, and they never scare you about the thing you should be scared about. It's always some bullshit. There's the government shutdown. They love to scare you with that one. Do you ever say every couple months they're always threatening, like, if things don't go well, we could have another government shutdown. And then they'll bring in a politician and be like, is this government shutdown your fault? And they're like, no, we don't want to shut the government down. It's the other party, their fault. And like sitting here like, who cares? Who the fuck cares? Do you guys remember the last government shutdown during Obama? You remember a couple years ago where did you make it through okay, your family? Everyone was all right? So the government shut down for 2 weeks, and it was a pretty normal 2 weeks. Like, we all just kept going to work. And they were like, the government shut down, and then, you're like, I guess we don't need a government. That's all you're proving to me. Like, shut it down permanently, and we'll all be a lot better off. You know, I said that at a show recently. They didn't have the reaction you had. And this woman got really upset with me, and she said, she stood up and she goes, I pray that we don't have another government shutdown. And I was taken back. Like, I was like, really? Like, who cares? Like, who would say that? I was like, why do you pray we don't have another government shutdown? And she goes, I'm a government employee. And I was like, oh yeah, that's who cares. Sorry, I'm sorry, I make a correction. There's one group of people who care. You guys. And so I was like, okay, fair enough. You don't want another government shutdown? And I asked her, I said, what do you do for the government? And she, with no hesitation, threw back at me so proudly. She goes, I work for the Department of Wildlife. And I was like, lady, I'm gonna be honest with you. I didn't even know we had a Department of Wildlife, so it's not the best thing to throw at me. You're losing a department I didn't even fucking know we had. How many useless departments do we have in this overbloated government that they're literally shutting things down that we... Wildlife! Wildlife! This is what you're throwing at me to avoid a government shutdown. Wildlife. You know one area who definitely doesn't need government intervention? Wildlife, okay? They will be just fine without you. I promise. You know what the wildlife did during the last government shutdown? I'll go out on a limb and say probably they continued to be wildlife.
Government comes from the consent of the people who are governed, then that means we're responsible for what government does. It's being done in our name. And the question is, if government has a monopoly on force, which I believe that's the definition of government, they have a monopoly on force. Everything government does is done at some level with the threat of a gun behind it. Now, when I speak to groups that aren't free market groups, I have to spend a lot of time explaining that government is violence. I'll skip over that whole section. So the question comes down to, and this is what changed me, the only things I can ask the government to do are the things that I myself would do if I had a gun and I knew justice. And the questions become very, very simple to me then. Because the question, would you use a gun to stop a murder? Well, you know, that's assuming I can tell that it's really a murder that's happening, which I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure I could tell that from vigorous CPR, but assuming I know that. And assuming I had a gun, which although I use it in our show and do a big bit on the Second Amendment, I don't actually carry. But assuming I had a gun, and assuming I'm not, that I weren't a coward, which I am. I'm not the one up here that's a decorated Marine helicopter pilot. Remember, I'm the one who's carny trash. Would I use a gun to stop a murder? Yes. Would I use a gun to stop a rape? Well, if I hadn't read about it in Rolling Stone, yes. Would I use a gun to protect personal property? Oh, man. Yeah, I would. Would I use a gun to build a library?
Are you for gun control?
Yeah.
Who should control the guns?
Who should control the guns? Probably the government.
Do you trust the government?
No.
You don't trust the government, but you want them to control the guns?
Nothing gets done. There's nothing different. If you don't pay your taxes, you will get thrown in jail. You will get in trouble.
And what happens if you resist?
You get thrown in jail.
What happens if you resist the people who come to throw you in jail?
They'll probably shoot you.
That's what I'm
Right.
talking about.
How is taxation theft?
How is it not? It's somebody saying, give me your money or I'll hurt you. And it actually came up before when people say, well, but they give us services. All right, well, if that's the justification, then give me $100 and tomorrow I'll give you a moldy sandwich and then we're good, right? Because as long as I give you something with some of the stolen meat after the fact, then it's okay. And of course, everybody says, well, no, that wouldn't be okay. Okay, well, then stop pretending it's not theft and stop pretending that them giving us something back afterwards retroactively makes armed robbery okay, because that's insane. Again, it's just people sticking up for mythology they were taught that they've never thought about and still haven't thought about. And they repeat stuff. Well, it's called taxation, so it's not the same. Okay, I call that zebra a striped horse. Now is it something different, or is it the same damn thing with different words?
I love how you call it a moldy sandwich. You can't even say it's a regular sandwich. You hate the state so much that they are not even a regular sandwich.
They're not efficient enough to make a normal sandwich.
U vindt belasting een vorm van diefstal?
Ja.
Met belasting zorgen wij voor faciliteiten voor alle burgers. Vindt u dat een legitiem doel van belastingen?
Nee.
Dus u woont nu in een sociale huurwoning?
Ja.
Mogelijk gemaakt?
Mogelijk gemaakt.
Doordat anderen... ja.
Zo, dat vind ik wel heel erg
maak daar wel gebruik van.
Sorry, de overheid neemt mij alles
school.
af wat ik heb. Neem mij mijn huis af, zodat ik word gedwongen om in sociale flat te wonen. En dan wilt u mij vertellen dat ik dankbaar moet zijn dat ze zo aardig zijn geweest om sociale flat te zorgen.
Ik heb niet gezegd dat u dankbaar
Ik krijg een
moet
beetje
zijn.
een DDR-gevoel, moet ik zeggen, als u dat zegt.
Gaan uw kinderen naar school?
Zo van, dat is dezelfde redenatie die ook werd gebruikt door de bestuurders van de DDR. Zo van, u heeft een opleiding genoten op kosten van de Oost-Duitse staat en nu wilt u vluchten, u bent asociaal. Dat is de redenering die ik hier bij u hoor. Ik vind het schokkend dat u dit durft te zeggen.
Ik vroeg of u daar gebruik van maakte. Ik neem aan dat uw kinderen naar school gaan. Dat wordt betaald via belastinggeld. Vindt u dat een legitiem doel voor belastinggeld?
Nee, ik wil daar best antwoord op geven, maar ik zie niet in wat dat bijdraagt aan de waarheidsvinding van deze commissie. Maar ik wil u best zeggen hoe ik daarover denk.
Nou, gisteren hadden wij hier een belastingadviseur en een hoogleraar die alles weet van de inkomstenbelasting, wat u ook pretendeert, die klanten helpt en informeert en begeleidt, maar die zegt, ja, natuurlijk moet je wel belasting betalen. Het zegt toch iets?
Ik zal u vertellen hoe ik hierover denk. Mijn visie is dat ieder mens recht heeft op zijn eigen lijf en goed. En dat ieder mens mag doen en laten wat hij wil, zolang hij geen inbreuk maakt op andermans lijf en goed. Dat is een fundamenteel mensenrecht, dat is het zelfbeschikkingsrecht. De overheid maakt daar inbreuk op door op verschillende manieren, waaronder de militaire dienstplicht, die nog steeds niet is afgeschaft, en ook door middel van belastingheffing. Nou, ik heb mijn brood verdiend met het adviseren van militaire dienstplichtigen bij het ontwijken van militaire dienstplicht, omdat ik dat zag als een groot onrecht, een vorm van dwangarbeid die werd opgelegd aan onschuldigen. En toen die werd opgeschort, heb ik mijn aandacht verlegd naar belastingontwijking, omdat ik uit diezelfde principes ook vind dat belastingheffing een inbreuk is op het eigendomsrecht. Het recht om te beschikken over de vruchten van je arbeid. De overheid heeft dat geld vervolgens de eerste paar duizend jaar gebruikt ter verrijking van de adel en de koning. Daarna is men het geld gaan weggeven voor een deel aan het volk. Heeft men cadeautjes aan het volk uitgedeeld om daarmee de belasting te legitimeren, maar die is daarmee niet gelegitimeerd. Je spreekt van roof als je eigendom wordt afgenomen onder bedreiging van geweld, zonder dat je schade toegebracht die weigert te vergoeden en zonder dat je verplichtingen weigert na te komen die je vrijwillig bent aangegaan. En dat is precies wat de overheid doet. Als je belasting moet betalen volgens de regels die de staat oplegt en je doet dat niet, dan komen de mensen langs om je huis leeg te halen. En als je er tegen verzet, dan word je als crimineel behandeld. Als je geen aangifte doet, dan word je maximaal 4 jaar in een hok opgesloten voor het niet doen van aangifte. Dat is hoe de staat aan haar geld komt, door mensen te bedreigen met opsluiting in een hok. En daar heb ik geen moeite mee als je dat doet met moordenaars, dieven, verkrachters, rovers, oplichters. Maar als je dat doet met onschuldige mensen die gevlieg hebben kwaad gedaan, en zoals bijvoorbeeld dienstplichtigen, zoals belastingbetalers, dan is dat een heel groot onrecht. En dat grote onrecht, daar strijd ik tegen. En daarom heb ik niet alleen een heel groot deel van mijn leven besteed aan het spreiden van deze ideeën in de vorm van mijn politiek leiderschap van de Libertarische Partij, maar heb ik ook besloten om mijn carrière te wijden aan het in bescherming nemen van individuen tegen het onrecht dat de staat hen probeert aan te doen. En het feit dat een deel van dat geld niet wordt gebruikt door de politieke elite om haar eigen zakken te vullen, maar dat een deel wordt gebruikt om cadeautjes uit te delen waar we niet om gevraagd hebben, dat is geen legitimatie van roof.
Tax is just about a system where politicians and bureaucrats steal money from their citizens to squander in the most disgraceful manner. This place is no exception. Fascinatingly, and I really don't know how you manage to keep a straight face when you're talking about tax evasion, the whole Commission and the Commission bureaucracy avoid their taxes. You don't pay taxes like citizens pay taxes. You have all sorts of special deals, composite tax rates, high tax thresholds, non-contributory pension schemes. You are the biggest tax avoiders in Europe, and here you sit pontificating. Well, the message is getting home to the people of the European Union. You're going to find that Eurosceptics are coming back in June in ever greater numbers. In ever greater numbers. And I can tell you worse, as the people get your number, it won't be long before they storm this chamber and they hang you, and they'll be right.
Let me ask you about the role of government. You've said about taxation, in a way that doesn't mince his words, the following. Taxation is immoral, you told the Libertarian Party News. Would you scrap the tax code altogether?
That'd be a pretty good idea, a pretty good start. I can qualify it if I'm allowed. Taxation is theft. When you take money from one group to give it to another, when you transfer the wealth. Now, taxation could be accomplished with user fees and, highway fees and gasoline taxes and import taxes. But the income tax is based on the assumption that the government owns you, owns all your income, and provides the conditions on which they allow you to keep a certain percentage. That, to me, is immoral, and the founders didn't like it. That's why the Constitution had to be amended in 1913.
Would I use a gun to build a library? I'm from a dead factory town in western Massachusetts, a poor town, Greenfield, Massachusetts. And I'm wicked old, 60 years old. I grew up before the internet. And I went to a terrible, terrible public school. But I've been 3 times redundant there. Terrible, terrible school. I didn't know jack. So I went to the library all the time. The library really, really mattered to me. The library is where I first read Kafka and Allen Ginsberg, because Frank Zappa told me to. It's where I first heard Stravinsky and Verez. It's where I first heard Alban Berg and Stockhausen. It's where I first learned about magic and juggling and religion, which for those of you who remember the Dewey Decimal System are all in the 900s. And man, I loved that library. I got on my bike and I rode there all the time. Frank Zappa said, skip the senior prom and go to the library if you've got any guts. Precisely what I did. But would I use a gun to build a library? Well, I'd put up my money to build a library. I'd beg you to put up money for a library. But would I point a gun at someone and say, we're taking your tax money to build a library? Would I do that? No, I wouldn't. And that, to me, is right where we go down the line. I love NASA. When Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, I cried so hard that I'm still crying now when I say Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. No, I wouldn't. That's got to be done privately. And I like crazy, crazy art. I like art that I bet everybody in this room hates. There was an artist named David Warnerowitz who got his NEA grants pulled in the 80s because NEA grants pulled because his stuff was very anti-Catholic and very pro-gay, and they pulled the NEA money from him. And he was one of my favorite artists. And my reaction when he lost his NEA grant was, I was living in New York at the time, I went to his studio, and I bought a lot of his work, because I figured he just lost his grant, needs money, probably be cheap. Would I use a gun for art? No, I wouldn't. I'd get rid of the NEA, because now we have Kickstarter, Indiegogo. We don't need it. They're more efficient. They're more honest, and they don't use force. They don't use guns. We do not use guns. I don't care how unpopular this is. I listen to NPR. I like Terry Gross. I like all that stuff a lot. But man, the fact that it's done at gunpoint makes me sick. And I don't care if it's only 2% or 1%. Guns do not belong in art. And when Penn and Teller were asked to play a series at a show, a series at a theater that was all done with NEA grants, we wouldn't do it. Because our show is too goddamn good. And if I need to point a gun at you to get you to come to my show, I need to find a different job. So that's how I became a libertarian.
Do you want to rule? Do you see the problems in your country and know how to fix them? If only you had the power to do so. Well, you've come to the right place. But before we begin this lesson in political power, ask yourself, why don't rulers see as clearly as you, instead acting in such selfish, self-destructive, short-sighted ways? Are they stupid, these most powerful people in the world, or is it something else? The throne looks omnipotent from afar, but it is not as it seems. Take the throne to act, and the throne acts upon you. Accept that, or turn back now before we discuss the rules for rulers. No matter how bright the rays of any sun king, no man rules alone. A king can't build roads alone, can't enforce laws alone, can't defend the nation or himself alone. The power of a king is not to act, but to get others to act on his behalf, using the treasure in his vaults. A king needs an army and someone to run it, treasure and someone to collect it, law and someone to enforce it. The individuals needed to make the necessary things happen are the king's keys to power. All the changes you wish to make are but thoughts in your head if the keys will not follow your commands. In a dictatorship where might makes right, the number of keys to power is small, perhaps only a dozen generals, bureaucrats, and regional leaders. Sway them to your side and the power to rule is yours, but never forget, displease them and they will replace you. Now, all countries lie on a spectrum from those where the ruler needs few key supporters to those where the ruler needs many. This foundation of power is why countries are different, yet many keys or few, the rules are the same. First, get the key supporters on your side. With them, you have the power to act. You have everything. Without them, you have nothing. Now, in order to keep those keys to power, you must, second, control the treasure. You must make sure your treasure is raised and distributed to you for all your hard work and to the keys needed to keep your position. This is your true work as a ruler, figuring out how best to raise and distribute resources so as not to topple the house of cards upon which your throne sits. Now you, aspiring benevolent dictator, may want to help your citizens, but your control of the treasure is what attracts rivals, so you must keep those keys loyal. But there's only so much treasure in your vaults, so much wealth your kingdom produces, so beware. Every bit of treasure spent on citizens is treasure not spent on loyalty. Thus, doing the right thing, spending the wealth of the nation on the citizens of the nation, hands a tool of power acquisition to your rivals. Treasure poured into roads and universities and hospitals is treasure a rival can promise to key supporters if only they switch sides. Benevolent dictators can spend their take on the citizens, but the keys must get their rewards, for even if you have gathered the most loyal, angelic supporters, they have the same problem as you, just one level down. Being a key to power is a position of power. They too must watch out for rivals from below or above. Thus, the treasure they get must also be spent to maintain their position. The loyal and dim may stay by your side no matter what, but smart key supporters will always watch the balance of power, ready to change allegiance if you look to be the loser in a shifting web of alliances. In countries where the keys are few, the rewards are great, and when violence rules, the most ruthless are attracted, and angels that build good works will lose to devils that don't. So buy all the loyalty you can, because loyalty in dictatorial organizations of all kinds is everything. For the ruler, anyway. Thus, the dictatorship exposed, a king who needs his court to raise the treasure to keep the court loyal and keep raising the treasure. This is the self-sustaining core of power. All outside is secondary. Now, a king with many key supporters has real problems. Not just their expense, but also their competing needs and rivalries are difficult to balance. The more complicated the social and financial web between them all, the more able a rival is to sway a critical mass. The more key supporters a ruler has on average, the shorter their reign. Which brings us to the third rule for rulers: minimize key supporters. If a key in your court becomes unnecessary, his skills no longer required, you must kick him out. After a successful coup, the new dictator will purge some of those who helped him come to power while working with the underlings of the previous dictator, which from the outside seems a terrible idea. Why abandon your fellow revolutionaries? Are the old dictator's supporters not a danger? But the keys necessary to gain power are not the same as those needed to keep it. Having someone on the payroll who was vital in the past but useless now is the same as spending money on the citizens. Treasure wasted on the irrelevant. And by definition, a dictator that pulls off a coup has promised greater treasure to those switching sides. The size of the vault has not changed, so the treasure must be split among fewer. A dictator that sways the right keys, takes control of the treasure, cuts unnecessary spending, kills unnecessary keys, will have a long and successful career. Seeing the structure unveiled, you might be excited to get started and control a country to the benefit of you and your cronies, or you might be exhausted, wishing to do good but seeing the structural difficulties. Now turn to democracy for salvation. So let us discuss rulers as representatives. You again might have grand dreams of the utopia you wish to build, but no man rules alone, and never more so than in democracy. Presidents and prime ministers must negotiate with their senates and parliaments and vice versa, and they all have their own key supporters to manage. In a well-designed democracy, power is fractured among many and is taken not with force, but with words, meaning you must get thousands or millions of citizens to, if not like you on election day, at least like you better than the alternative. With so many voters and such fractured power, it's impossible to, as a dictator would, follow these rules and buy loyalty. Or is it? Of course not. Don't think of citizens as individuals with their individual desires, but instead as divided into blocks: the elderly or homeowners or business owners or the poor. Blocks you can reward as a group. Democracies have wildly complicated tax codes and laws, not as accident, but as reward for the blocks that get and keep the ruling representatives in power. Farming subsidies, for example, have nothing to do with the food a nation needs, but entirely with how key the vote of the farming bloc is. Countries where farmers' votes don't swing elections don't have farming subsidies. If a bloc doesn't vote, such as younger citizens, then no need to divert rewards their way. Even if large in number, they are irrelevant to gaining power, which is good news for you. One less block to sway, and the treasure you give your key blocks has to come from somewhere. If you want long years in office, Rule 3 is your friend in a democracy just as much as a dictatorship. You can't eliminate those who don't vote for you, but there is still much you can do. Once in power, make it easier for your key blocks to vote and harder for others. Establish voting systems that reduce the number of blocks you need to win, the more rivals you get. Very handy indeed. Draw election borders to predetermine the results for you or your cronies, and have party pre-elections with Byzantine rules to determine who blocks even can vote for. Mix and match the above for even better power perpetuation. When approval ratings couldn't be lower, yet re-election rates couldn't be higher, you'll know you've succeeded.
I am afraid of is cops. That's who fucking scares me. Like our own fucking cops, because they arrest you for anything. You ever see those like YouTube videos where like they'll be like, you know, at like a checkpoint and they're like license and registration, and the guys were like, you don't have the constitutional authority to have Jesus Christ, bro. People really believe in shit. It doesn't matter how ridiculous it is. People believe in these crazy, ridiculous, made-up mythologies, just like ridiculous, untrue things that you're taught when you're little. You know, stupid shit, like you have rights. And then people believe that, like it's a real thing. I was talking to one of my friends, he was like protesting the cops, and he let this fly out of his mouth. This is even worse than you have rights. He said this to me, he goes, you know, what's fucked up about the cops is they work for us. I was like, what? No, they don't. No, they work. I'm sure you were taught that in like a civics class somewhere, but that's just bullshit that they say to like keep you in line. The cops don't work for us. That's like that's testable. You think the cops work for us? Okay, let prove it. I want one of you guys to go outside right now, round up a bunch of cops, and just, you know, start bossing them around a little bit. And we're gonna find out pretty quickly who the cops work for. Amazing. They go, the cops were, and so I said this to my friend, and he got very defensive because I started making fun of his, and this, you know, when you challenge people's bullshit mythology, they tend to get defensive. So he's like, well, no, I'm not saying like they work for us, but what I'm saying is the way the system is supposed to work is I pay my tax dollars and that pays his salary. So he works for me. And I was like, okay, that is some interesting logic right there. Okay, so you pay your tax dollars, that pays someone's salary, so they work for you. Well, here's the part of that equation that you are willfully leaving out. You don't choose to pay your tax dollars. You fucking have to, okay? You have to. You have to at the threat of violence. At the threat of, we will throw you in a cage if you don't pay these, and then you pay them. Someone doesn't work for you if you have to pay them after they threatened you. Someone only works for you if you choose to pay them. That would be like if someone mugged you, and then you were like, okay, I guess that guy works for me now. I mean, I'm paying his salary. It wasn't until he threatened me that I paid his salary, but under this retarded logic that I've cultivated, I guess this guy works for me now. And I'll be honest, I wasn't even planning on hiring a new employee today, so it's been a pretty good day for me. This is my day off. If you pay your tax dollars and that pays someone's salary, not only do they not work for you, you work for them. Literally. Literally. You work, and you get money for the work, and then you give it to them. You work for them. And then they've got you so mind-fucked that not only do you work for them, but then after you give them the money, you go, sucker. I mean, that is some unbelievable shit. I wish I had thought of it.
The reduction in world poverty over the last 50 years as the result of free trade and free markets has dwarfed anything that the socialists has ever been able to achieve. The socialists have this program called take money from the rich and give it to the poor. Take money from the able and give it to the less able, or however you want to phrase it. And that has generally driven entire societies, if not civilizations, into penury. But the idea of open up free markets, open up trade, and how much, like in China and India alone, in India, 50,000 people a month are moving into the middle class. It has been the biggest single reduction of poverty even since the 1990s, just a couple of decades.
In all history.
And this should
In
never
all
have
history.
happened under capitalism, and it should have flourished under socialism. And now that the empirical evidence is going against everything they stand for, everything they claim they wanted, we actually find out how much they really wanted it. Because if they say, well, we want the poor to become wealthier, if that's the real goal, they should be saying, I'm setting fire to capital and I'm going to praise Adam Smith. But they don't do that. So I really question whether they do really want to help the poor, or are using the poor as guilt clubs to beat down and take power over others.
What is the case for privatization? The case are two, ethical and economic. The ethical case for privatization is that it's compatible with the non-aggression principle. If things are private, then we can buy and sell, rent, lend, whatever, and there's no violation of rights. Whereas if it's done through the government, then there necessarily is a rights violation, because the government is per se an invasive organization, because it taxes us and it doesn't have our permission to do so. None of us have signed a contract with the government. Therefore, when it's not private, namely when it's in the public sphere, then there are problems of ethics because there's compulsion. Later I'll get into the third possibility between government and private, and that's non-ownership, but I'll get into that when I do oceans. Okay, so the ethical case, I think, is clear. The case for economics, the economic case for privatization is we'll be wealthier if things are private than if they're not. The reason we have pretty good wristwatches and ties and shirts and shoes and cars and things like that is because if somebody doesn't do a good job, they can go broke and they have to exit and do something else. Whereas in the government, if they don't do a good job, like in the post office, they just keep on going and going. So that's one advantage. Another advantage is the advantage that Mises puts in, that if you have, to the extent that you have government, you don't have a rational economic system of prices that reflect scarcity. Hayek tells us that information emanates from free prices, and if you don't have free prices, the information that prices give you is not indicative of scarcity or desires or anything like that. And the third one is incentives. If we have something done by government, we have less incentive to produce because you can't fail. Another one is we as consumers have more control over producers than we as citizens have control over our politicians. We get to vote for our politicians once every 4 years. We get to vote for a dollar vote for our suppliers of goods and services every time we buy or sell something. So it could be every second or every day or whatever. Another reason is that in the market, you don't have to have a package deal. In the market, you could buy a violin and a motorcycle and a sailboat. In the case of the government, it's a package deal. If there are two parties and you like policies 1, 3, 5, and 7 of one party and 2, 4, 6, and 8 of the other, you got to pick one or the other. You just can't get one from column A and one from column B. You can't pick what you want. Whereas in the market, you can go and pick this, you can pick that, you can satisfy yourself. There's no package deal imposed upon you.
Now, I talk to libertarians or listen to them or view them on TV, and they're talking about government power all the time and abuse of governmental power. But I also see some libertarians, not a whole lot of them, but a lot of them also talk about corporate power as well. In other words, they're talking about power in general. There seem to be two types of libertarians.
Well, I think we have one type of libertarian because we all accept the same principle. I think it's more easily found that you have several types of Republicans and several types of Democrats because they're interventionists and they can intervene any way they want. But I think libertarians are pretty consistent in certainly condemning the power of government. I haven't heard a libertarian saying that we need more government or they're not a libertarian. But on the corporate power, I think where the confusion might come is corporate size, if it's gained by serving the consumer, is not necessarily evil. So if you have 90% of the car industry, for some miraculous reason, or for some unknown reason, there's no imports. If you have 90% of it, that doesn't bother me as a libertarian if you have the best car at the best price and the consumers are very happy. Now, if you have 90% or 100% of a utility company and you're gouging the customers and the customers have no place else to go, we detest the corporate size. We detest corporate power when it's gained through government power, government coercion. If it's a contract, the military-industrial complex is a pretty good example of how large industries benefit by big government. Of course, in banking, big banks benefit by this monetary system because they're sort of in collusion with the Federal Reserve System, so we detest that. We detest bigness, and we detest corporate power when it's gained through privilege from government. If corporations are large, and there's always free entry in a free market, if they're large because they serve the consumer, we don't worry too much about that because we know the consumer is benefiting. If they get to the point, if they had 100% of an industry, which is not possible in a free market, but let's say, just for instance, if they had 100%, and then they started to gouge the people, there would immediately be competition. There always has to be free entry and free competition. But nobody's ever figured out where there's ever been a true monopoly in a free market system. All monopolies can be traced to some form of government.
That having government be the sort of the negative way to say it is like having a monopoly on violence, but basically being the arbiter of, or the people that making sure that violence doesn't get out of hand. That would
2020 show that. Yep, the government's great at that. Yep.
Well, what's okay without
this is him with a straight face making that argument. Good work, Yaron.
All right. Well, can you with a straight face argue for the idea that in anarchism, violence would not get out of hand?
Sure. For one thing, if your worst argument against one of my little quotes is, what are presented as the strongest arguments against anarchism are inevitably descriptions of the status quo. So the argument is, under anarchism, you'd have warlords, killing people, and then you'd have, whoever's strongest gets to just take over a neighborhood. Well, we have that now. We saw that the police are perfectly comfortable disarming the population, and then when they try to protect themselves are punished. We're happy to stand down. You can only have that happen if you have a monopoly. If they're let's suppose you had television stations, right? And CBS said, you know what? We're not going to broadcast. Cool. You don't broadcast. We're going to watch any of these other channels. So the problem with having a monopoly is everyone has to be dependent on this issue. What's amazing about minarchism, which objectivists are, is they will argue that government is really, really bad at everything it does and it touches. Therefore, it has to be in charge of the most important stuff.
Well, that's not therefore, but there is a thing that's fundamentally different than all the other things.
But Yaron Brook also said that no government has this is on your show, has ever worked in the way he's proposing. Now, objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, is based on objective reality. And what she posited is you look and study the facts of nature, facts of reality, and deduce things accordingly. And she very much regards herself as part of the Aristotelian tradition, as opposed to the Platonist tradition, where the idea precedes reality and the idea is more real than what we see around us. So what he's saying is all the data, according to him, contradicts his argument, but still he's going to make this imaginary government that has never existed, and there's no evidence that it can exist. Let's talk about objective law. To have access to the legal system, which is something we want, even just in terms of settling disputes, when you have a government monopoly, it's going to be more expensive, more difficult for poor people. The cost of hiring a lawyer is more expensive than hiring a surgeon. You can't say with a straight face, this is the only way or the best way.
Okay, so...
And the other thing is the argument for objectivism. They have this against anarchism. They have this stupid claim. It's like, what if, you're a member of one security company and I'm a member of another, and we have a dispute and one shows up the door. What happens now? As if this is some insuperable argument. Well, we have that on Earth. Every country is in a state of anarchism regarding every other country. We don't have a world government. So what happens if a Canadian kills an American in Mexico? I have no idea. I bet you don't have an idea. What I'm sure of is that system has been worked out ahead of time between the three countries, and it's been worked out in such a way that you and I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Same thing with cell phone companies. If I'm on Sprint, you're on Metro PCS, and I call you, who pays? Does Sprint pay you? Do they split the difference? First of all, there's no objective way that one has to work. But the thing is, companies who have auto accidents, they have arbitrage all the time. Like if I run into you, they work it out, and it never reaches our desk. So the only thing that cops are good at is keeping people, at any government monopoly, is forcing people to be their customers by keeping them unsafe.
My topic for today is going to be the irrationality of our politics. Now, I'm going to start by giving a couple of examples of what I mean by political irrationality. And then after that, I'm going to give a theory of how we wind up with irrational policies. And then finally, I'm going to try and draw some lessons for us as individuals about combating the problem of political irrationality. All right, so I start with two examples, and this is my first example of what I would consider political irrationality. It's the war on terror. Okay, now this graph shows the number of fatalities due to terrorism in the United States. This is from the RAND Corporation has an excellent database of terrorist incidents, and so this is from their database. And what you can see is there have been about 3,200 fatalities. This is just in the United States over the course of about 50 years. And you can see the big spike is the 9/11/2001 attack. The smaller spike that you can barely see, that's the Oklahoma City bombing. And there are a couple of other incidents, but they're too small for you to see on the graph. Now, it's interesting to compare this to two other things. So this is the cost of the problem that we have to deal with. And it's interesting to compare this, first of all, to another problem. So compare it to the number of people who've been killed by murderers in general in the United States. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but on this graph, the red is, again, the terrorist murders, people who were murdered by terrorists in the United States. The blue is the people who were murdered by non-terrorists in the United States over the same time period, the last 50 years. The terrorists killed about 0.4% of the total. The non-terrorists killed 802,000 people, or 99.6% of the total. Now, this initially makes it difficult to understand the priority that's been placed on terrorism by the United States government, by the media, and even by the general public. Now, the other comparison that I think is interesting is comparing the costs of terrorism to the costs of the war on terror. So I have this on the next slide. This is, on the left, the people who have been killed by terrorism, and on the right, this is just Americans who've been killed fighting the war on terrorism. That's the deaths of US servicemen. It's about 6,300, most of them in Iraq, but also a lot of them in Afghanistan. Now, but that is actually only the tip of the iceberg as far as the cost of the war on terror goes. So on the next slide I have, these are the people who have been killed, on the far right, the people who have been killed in foreign countries, most of them civilians. It's over 230,000. And again, on the left, you have the people who were killed by terrorism. Now, I don't have time to talk about all of the costs of the war on terror. This is only the most obvious. And also don't have time to talk about what alternative policies would be. But I just want to make this suggestion that if you have a policy that kills 70 times as many people as the problem that you're trying to solve, then that's usually like a prima facie indicator that it might be an irrational policy.
I hope you haven't fallen for this fucking global fucking lie called the war on terror. It's for the creation of perpetual war, because you can't end a fucking war on terror, can you? Plus, you can't have a war on terror because you can't have a war on a noun. Understand? No, you can't. You need a country or nation state to wage war. You can't wage a war on a noun. Terror or terrorism, which they claim is an ideology, and terrorism is not an ideology. It's a political technique used to motivate revolution. But they've turned it into an ideology, and through the mainstream media with massive political agendas have connected it to Muslims, making it that terrorism is an ideology inherent within Islam, which is a fucking lie, because no one's religion actually has terrorism as an ideology. Even though, personally, I would think that most fundamentalist religions are psychological and spiritual terrorism unto themselves, but that's not what we're talking about. So, we have the war on terror, do we? Now, what's the end of the war on terror? What's the end? When's it going to end? What's the end plan? When you've got the terror? We've got an exit strategy on this motherfucker. Once the terror's gone, we're going to exterminate the terror. And we're going to move on to horror. Next. We'll have the war on horror. We'll get those goth fuckers. We'll get them. Drag those bastards down to Guantanamo Bay, no worries. Hard to get them to wear orange, but, you know, we'll give it a fucking go. Unbelievable. You're having a war on terror, are you? That's right. What does war create? Terror. Excellent. So you're having a war against the consequence of the actions you're involved in. Everybody else is good terror. It's good, peace, freedom, loving terror. Yeah. Kind of like terror light. Yeah. Sort of a diet terror. Yeah. Sort of like, can't believe it's not terror. It's a sort of... It's utterly terror, dropping the most high-tech military equipment in the world on people who live with goats. That's terror. Do you understand? It's fucking terror. They're creating terror, and then they're calling these people extremists. They get the most high-tech military equipment in the universe, and they drop it on people in huts, and they go, they're extreme. These people are extremists, so we've got 500-pound depleted uranium shells to drop on their goats because they're extreme. They're extremists. And it's good to be up here on the moderate side.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man in there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Quite simply, a statist is somebody who believes in having a state. Basically, anybody who wants government. Government is the exercise of authority over a people or place, and that is basically the right to rule. It's not just the ability to control other people, because most people have that in one way or another. It's the right. It's the idea that certain people, it's legitimate for them to forcibly control others. Belief in government is a purely faith-based, indoctrinated belief. It doesn't actually make any sense in practical terms or in evidence or in logic. For years, I thought it was a really good analogy to compare government to religion. And only a few years ago did I realize it's not an analogy. It is a religion in every way. It has a superhuman deity, government, that has rights that mortals don't. It isn't restricted by the rules that apply to mortals. It issues commands, and if you disobey, you're a sinner, and you deserve to be punished. The faithful, the true believers, they have great faith in these bizarre rituals, elections and legislation and appointments, and they dress up and then they say, ta-da, now I represent government. I know I just look like a person, but I don't just have the rights of a person because I represent the magical deity called government. And so I'm allowed to demand your money and boss you around and hurt you if you disobey me. I'm acting on behalf of government, and it has commandments called laws. And these laws aren't just the threats of humans. They are decrees from something superhuman. And so all you good people out there should bow to this deity. And if you want the world fixed, this is what you pray to. And we give you certain rituals of how to pray to it and when you're supposed to pray to it. And pray to the God to make the world what you wish it was and to save you from all the uncertainties of reality. The doctrine people are taught is just patently absurd. And a bunch of examples of that are like consent of the governed. There isn't such thing. If it's consent, it's voluntary. If it's being governed, it's not. The actual given excuse is, we have the right to rule you because you decided we did, even if you didn't vote for us, and even if you oppose everything we do to you. And, well, they represent us. Okay, they represent us by doing a lot of things that we don't have the right to do. And they represent us by bossing us around and taking our money. Like, I bet if I went to my neighbor and bossed him around and took his money and said, I'm representing you, he would say, what? What a stupid thing to say. To me, the most insane is, we are the government, which you hear everywhere. And I ask somebody, wait, do you really not notice that there's a group of people over there, they issue threats, and they call them laws, and they issue demands for money, and they call it taxes, and if you disobey, they send men with guns to hurt you. Now, are you really incapable of distinguishing between yourself and them? One of the biggest giveaways that the belief in government is a complete blind faith religious belief is the way people respond. One very easy line of questioning is, can you give somebody else a right that you don't have? And everybody says, well, no, of course not. Well, how about you and your buddy? Can the two of you give someone else a right that neither of you had? Well, no. And it only takes a couple more questions to get to, well, how did Congress get rights that you don't have? They get emotional and they get angry or they get defensive or they run away. They didn't come to this belief through reasoning and evidence and logic. They came there by having a blind faith belief smashed into their heads starting before they could even talk. It's just something they were taught to believe, that there's this thing called authority and that it's allowed to do things that human beings aren't and that people have an obligation to obey it, to the point where, yeah, it's some people, they weren't gods or anything, some people wrote down a thing on paper and then they called it legislation and they did certain rituals and then people go around saying, well, this is law. Most people literally feel physical discomfort and fear at the thought of disobeying anyone in authority. Most people can't say, no, I'm not going to do that, because it goes against their years and years of programming and indoctrination that trains them to think, if you do as you're told, you're good. If you don't, you're bad. And that's the message of school, and that message gets pounded in people's heads. Students are taught over and over and over and over again, every stinking day they're in school, that the measure of your virtue is how well you obey authority. the whole approval-disapproval thing. The one thing you learn in school is if you do as you're told, you get approval and reward. And if you don't do as you're told, you get disdain and condemnation. They'll make sure everybody knows you're a bad person because you didn't do as you were told. The belief in authority leads everybody, good people, bad people, everything in between, to advocate and do things they wouldn't otherwise do, bad things they wouldn't otherwise do, including cops, because the cops really and truly believe that they have the right to do things that I don't have the right to do and you don't have the right to do. The only reason most of them do what they do is because they believe in authority and they really believe that legislation gives them an exemption from morality. So that when they do something and someone says, hey, what you're doing is bad, hey, I don't make the law, I just enforce it. I'm not responsible for my actions, I'm just a tool of some weird thing somewhere else called government. You can't blame me for what I am personally doing because I'm not really doing it. As loony as that is, that's what most of them will say whenever somebody says, hey, what you're doing is wrong. It's not okay to, it's not okay to lock people up for smoking marijuana. It's not okay, all the ways in which quote-unquote law enforcement initiates violence against nonviolent people. And if you bring that up to them, they literally talk as if they didn't do it. The only reason they do that is because they were taught the lie of authority and government and law along with everyone else, and then they were told, you're just a tool of the thing called law, and that makes it so you have rights that other people don't have. So you don't have to feel bad about physically assaulting nonviolent people because the law says it's okay. It really is just permission to ignore your conscience by saying you have rights that other people don't. You don't have the right to tell other people what habit to have on your own. You don't have the right to go and extort people on your own. But once you're law enforcement, then not only is it okay, it's noble and great to go around robbing people and bossing them around. That is the biggest danger of the belief in authority. It tricks good people into condoning or doing really nasty, horrible, violent things because they think, well, this is okay if government and authority does it.
They are raised by their parents, by the school, by the government, by the culture, by all the authoritarian messages built into everything to think that obedience is a virtue. And when you raise the culture to think that, and you get one nasty psycho at the top who says, hey, go do bad stuff, people say, well, I have to follow orders. I have to obey the law. I have to do as I'm told because that's a virtue. And then good people march off and do evil stuff. I'm not scared of the Maos and the Stalins and the Hitlers. I'm scared of the thousands or millions of people that hallucinate them to be authority and so do their bidding and pay for their empires and carry out their orders. I don't care if there's one loony with a stupid mustache. He's not a threat if the people do not believe in authority. Some people assume that, well, you must trust everybody if you don't want government. That's not at all true. I don't nearly trust everybody, but if I don't trust people to run their own lives, why on earth would I trust them to be in a position of power where they can forcibly run other people's lives?
Really what it boils down to is saying, I don't trust people. People are untrustworthy and unpredictable. So my solution is to take some of those people, some of the most untrustworthy around, give them permission to violently control us all. And that will protect us from the untrustworthiness of mankind. Okay, you're so scared of the average man out there and so thankful for government. Let me ask you, who has taken more of your money under threat of force? Private people threatening you or agents of authority threatening you? How many murders are committed by private people compared to how many are committed by people acting on behalf of authority? It's not even close. The number of murders committed in the name of law enforcement and government and authority completely dwarfs private murder. Even governments killing the people of other countries is small compared to them killing their own people. In the last 100 years, over 270 million human beings killed by their own governments, not counting war. That first step is always the hardest, to get someone to dare to set aside his blind faith long enough to think about things, to back up enough to say, maybe government isn't even legitimate at all. It takes a lot for people indoctrinated into the faith to dare to think of those literally blasphemous ideas that, no, those people in Washington don't have the right to rule. Their threats aren't laws, they're just threats. Their demands aren't taxes, it's just extortion. And that really feels like heresy, because it is. It is heresy against the God called government. I now have a huge amount of hope, because I see an acceleration of the number of people who dare to think about these things, and now the number of people able to have this conversation is just hugely exploding. And they're still a minority, but that exponential curve, I don't think it's stopping. I really think the cult of statism is as good as dead. Ultimately, I think the belief in government is doomed for the exact same reasons that the belief in a flat earth was doomed. There's too many people pointing out the utter inherent insanity in the belief, and that's just not going to go away. Nobody who understands self-ownership and understands why authority is inherently bogus wakes up the next day and says, suddenly, I think I should do whatever the politicians say. I think really humanity is just beginning to wake up to what it's supposed to be. Humanity wasn't meant to be a domesticated species owned by a ruling class. Every human being owns himself, is in charge of his own life. I'd like to see actual rational moral civilization in my lifetime, but we are going to get there. Sooner or later, we are totally going to get there. The lie will never outlive the truth forever.